It's 5:19 in the morning, June 10th, 1912, and a small nervous English minister steps aboard a westbound train as it pulls out of Villisca, Iowa. He's barely 5'2", slight of build, with a face that nearly everyone who met him described as peculiar. As the train picks up speed, he turns to the strangers in the carriage and mentions quietly that there are 8 dead souls back in Villisca, butchered in their beds while they slept. He says it plainly, like he already knows. The trouble is, nobody in Villisca knows yet. The bodies won't be found for another 2 hours. But by the time the sun is fully up over Montgomery County, 8 people will be discovered inside a house on East 2nd Street. 6 of them children, every one of them killed with an axe. The man on the train will eventually be arrested for these murders. He'll be tried for them twice, and both times he'll walk free. But the strangest thing about the Villisca case isn't how the man on the train got away. It's that the town, in the days and years that followed, made sure no one could ever catch him. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders. 8 people killed in a single night, in a case that wasn't so much unsolved as it was lost. Villisca is almost always told as a whodunit, a list of suspects and an ending that lands in the way that every unsolved case does, with a shrug. The killer was clever, the error was primitive, we'll never know. But that framing quietly hands the killer credit he may not deserve. It treats the case as unsolvable because of what he did. But the reality is less comfortable. This case was likely unsolved less because of the murderer and more because of what the people who were supposed to catch him did to the case after he was gone. Because the case wasn't lost once, it was lost twice. The first time was physical, and it happened in a single afternoon. The fingerprints, the footprints, the weapon, the exact position of everything the killer had touched, gone by the middle of the day. Not because the killer covered his tracks, but because the town walked over them. The second loss took 5 years. The investigation slowly stopped being an investigation and curdled into a feud between 2 of the most powerful men in the county and a private detective with his own reason for wanting a particular answer. By the time anyone stood trial, the case had become a weapon people were using on each other. So the real question isn't only who killed the Moore family, it's harder than that. What happens to the truth when a community decides almost at once what it wants the truth to be? Hold on to that, because everything that follows comes back to it. To understand what was lost, you have to know who was in the house. Josiah Moore, known as Joe to everyone in town, was 43, and by Villisca's standards he'd done well. He'd worked nearly a decade at an implement store run by Frank Jones, one of the most wealthiest and influential men in the county, before leaving in 1908 to start his own business and taking the lucrative John Deere dealership with him. That detail matters a great deal later. For now, just know that Joe Moore's success had come, in part, at another man's expense. His wife Sarah was 39. She played piano at a Presbyterian church and sat near the centre of the town's small social world. Together they had 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, the youngest, was 5. On Sunday, June 9th, the family attended the annual Children's Day program at the church, which Sarah had helped organise. The Moore children performed along with 2 friends, sisters named Lena and Ina Mae Stillinger. Lena was 11 and Ina Mae was 8. Their family had a farm outside of town, and that evening the girls asked to stay over at the Moore house instead of going home. A phone call was made and permission was given. The program ended around 9:30, and they all walked the 3 blocks home together through the warm June dark, arriving close to 10. 8 people going inside a house they had every reason to think was safe. That was the last time any of them was seen alive, because somewhere inside, most likely the attic, reached through a small door hidden in a closet, someone else was already there, waiting. The next morning, June 10th, a neighbour named Mary Peckham noticed the Moore house was unusually silent. The chickens hadn't been let out, the blinds were still drawn, which was strange for that hour. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer, and found that the front door had been locked from the inside, which was strange because nobody in Villisca locked their doors. She called Joe's brother Ross, who arrived with a spare key. While Mary waited on the porch, Ross let himself in, walked to the downstairs guest room, opened the door, and came straight back out. By the time he reached the step, he could barely stand, so he asked Mary to call the marshal. Marshal Hank Horton arrived around 8:30, and what he found room by room was something no one in Villisca had ever seen before. Every person in the house had been killed in their bed, in their sleep, with an axe that belonged to Joe Moore himself, left behind in the downstairs bedroom. But it was what the killer did after that has kept people talking for over 100 years. In every room, a piece of cloth had been laid over each victim's face. Every mirror in the house had been covered. The windows without blinds were draped with aprons and skirts until the rooms were nearly dark, even in daylight. The axe, which turned out to be Joe's, had been wiped down and propped up against the parlour wall. And on the floor beside it, for reasons no one has ever been able to explain, sat a slab of uncooked bacon from the family's icebox, wrapped in a towel. There was a kerosene lamp that had been taken from a dresser, its glass chimney removed and set carefully out of the way under a chair with the wick turned down low. Whoever did this wanted just enough light to see, but not enough to be seen. There was a bowl of bloodied water where he appeared to have rinsed his hands, and a plate of uneaten food. He'd not been in a hurry. He stayed in that house in the dark for what may have been hours. Sit with what that means. Whoever did this was calm enough to walk through the house, cover the bodies in every mirror, wash his hands, and let himself out of the front door, locking it behind him. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't running. Hold on to the lamp in particular. It's the closest thing this case has to a fingerprint, and by the end, it points somewhere very specific. The coroner's examination put the time of death between midnight and 5 in the morning. Each of the children, and Sarah, had been struck in the head with the blunt end of the axe, around 20 to 30 times. Joe, however, had been struck with the sharp edge and had been hit more times than anyone else. The ceilings above the beds in both upstairs rooms had gouge marks from the upswing of the axe between blows. By any measure, the attacks were overkill. And out of the 8 victims, only Lena Stillinger appears to have woken. She was found lying crossways on the bed, with a wound on her arm and a bloodstain on her knee, signs that she'd briefly fought back. Examinations at the time concluded there was no evidence of further harm beyond what had killed her, but the state of the scene around her raised questions that investigators were never able to resolve. We'll come back to Lena at the end, because out of everyone in this case, she's the one most people will remember. When investigators tried to work out how the killer got in, they turned to the attic, where they reportedly found 2 used cigarettes on the floor. Though the house's own tour now disputes that detail, so treat it carefully. If it's accurate, it's striking, because no one in the household smoked, and the attic was not a place anyone had a reason to go. The working theory has always been that the killer entered earlier that Sunday evening, likely while the family was at church, climbed into the attic, and waited. Think about what that means. Someone sat in the dark above those bedrooms for hours while the family came home, ate dinner, talked to the Stillinger girls, put the children to bed, and turned out the lights. And then, well after midnight, came down. He had hours to change his mind, but he didn't. That patience tells you the most. This wasn't someone who snapped or lost control. This was a person who had a long time to think about exactly what he was going to do, and he did it anyway. There's something most people don't learn until they dig into this case, and it changes how the whole thing reads. Villisca wasn't the only one. In the year or so before it, a string of strikingly similar axe murders moved across the middle of the country. In September of 1911, 2 families were killed in their beds in a single night in Colorado Springs. 6 people in all. Weeks later, a family was murdered in Illinois. In October, 5 members of the Showman family were killed in the same way in Ellsworth, Kansas. And just days before Villisca, a married couple, the Hudsons, were found murdered in a small town called Parlor. Their faces were covered, the weapon left behind, shades drawn, and the doors locked. At least half a dozen of these crimes had taken place across neighbouring states in under a year, and the signatures kept repeating. Victims killed in their sleep, family's own weapon, faces covered, drawn windows, and more than once, a lamp burning low, and they were always near rail lines. But in 1912, the idea of a serial killer barely existed. The term wouldn't be coined for another 60 years, and investigators had no framework for a man who killed strangers in town after town for no apparent reason. So they looked closer to home, at grudges and money, and the people who had a reason to hate Joe Moore. Keep this string of murders in mind, because by the end, it matters more than any local suspect. But the question is, were these crimes one man's work, or a run of grim coincidences? What stands out more for you? Because researchers have argued it both ways for decades. Now to the first death of the case. Word moved through a town of 2,000 people fast. Within hours, the Moore house had stopped being a crime scene in any real sense and had become the most extraordinary thing that ever happened in Villisca. And people came to see it. By most estimates, around 100 curious townspeople moved through the house before anyone secured it. They walked the rooms, looked at the bodies, handled the door frames and walls. The axe, the single most important object in the case, was reportedly picked up and passed around, until whatever the killer had left on it was gone. And at least one man took a fragment of Joe Moore's skull off the floor and walked out with it, to keep. It's easy to make that sound like a horror story, but it was something more ordinary, which makes it worse. A community that at that point didn't understand a crime scene was something you could destroy. There was no protocol, barely an idea of physical evidence as we'd recognise it today. A local druggist who was also an amateur photographer showed up to take pictures and was turned away because it was considered too ghoulish. So the one record nobody could have trampled was never made. No usable crime scene photos ever survived. The National Guard didn't lock down the house until around noon. Bloodhounds were brought in the next day and tracked a scent from the house to the nearby Nodaway River, where it was lost. By the time anyone was thinking clearly about evidence, the answer to what happened in that house was probably still inside it that morning and had already been stepped on by the people who only wanted to help. This is the part most retellings rush past, and it's the part that matters the most. Everything investigators will spend the next decade fighting over, every theory, every trial, was built on a foundation that was gone before the investigation even started. Not even a modern prosecutor would touch a scene compromised that badly. With no physical evidence to speak of, the case turned into something else. It became a story the town told about itself. And in a small town, the most obvious story is usually about the person with the most obvious grudge. That was Frank Jones. Jones was Joe Moore's former employer. 57 years old, a banker, a businessman, and an Iowa state senator. When Joe left his store and took the John Deere dealership, it reportedly cost Jones a lot of money, and the two men had been on bad terms ever since. There was also a rumour, although never proven, that Joe had been involved with Jones's daughter-in-law. Whether any of it was true mattered less than the fact that the town believed it. Suspicions settled on Jones early, and it never really lifted. This is where the slow second death of the case begins. A private detective named James Wilkerson, working for the Burns Agency out of Kansas City, took up the theory and ran with it for years. He became convinced that Jones had hired a man named William Mansfield to do the killing, and Mansfield was genuinely a frightening figure. In 1914, 2 years after Villisca, he was suspected in the axe murders of his own wife, infant child and in-laws in Illinois, crimes that were said to resemble the Moore family killings closely. But there was a problem. Payroll records placed Mansfield hundreds of miles away in Illinois on the night of the murders. He had an alibi on paper, but he was arrested anyway in 1916 on Wilkerson's insistence, and the grand jury refused to indict him. He was released and later sued Wilkerson for defamation and won. Still, neither Wilkerson nor the town let go of Jones. The accusation became a public campaign, and Jones fought back the way a powerful man does. He sued Wilkerson for slander. That suit turned into something remarkable. Wilkerson's defense was, in effect, that it couldn't be slander because everything he said was true. So the trial became an attempt to try a sitting state senator for murder all over again, inside a lawsuit. The jury sided with Wilkerson. Look at what that means. By this point, the case wasn't being investigated. It was being litigated between enemies. The town had split along church lines. Jones was a prominent Methodist. The Moores were Presbyterian. And people lined up for or against his guilt depending on where they sat on Sundays. Jones lost his seat, and his reputation never recovered. He reportedly came to call the whole fight one of the worst mistakes of his life. But no charge against him ever survived the grand jury because there was no evidence. There couldn't be. It had been destroyed in 1912. For 5 years, the energy that should have gone into solving the crime went into a fight over who got to be the villain. And that fight set up the strangest chapter of all, the one that brings us back to the man on the train. His name was Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, an English minister who was 34 years old. He'd come to Villisca to help teach at the same Children's Day programme and left on the early train the next morning, hours before the bodies were found. On its own, that wasn't damning. He'd been scheduled to leave. What drew attention was everything after. The remark on the train before anyone knew the family was dead. A bloodstained shirt he had reportedly sent to a dry cleaner. And years of long rambling letters to investigators and the victims' families showing what many described as an unhealthy fixation on the case. In 1917, with the Jones theory in ruins and the town desperate for an ending, a grand jury indicted Kelly for the murder of Lena Stillinger. After repeated interrogations that summer, he signed a confession claiming he'd heard the voice of God on the night of the murders telling him to slay and slay utterly. Almost at once he recanted, saying it had been coerced. But the case went to trial anyway. By then, much of Montgomery County had come to believe Kelly was being framed, a convenient broken man used to close a case and protect more powerful interests. His first trial in September of 1917 ended in a hung jury, split 11-1 for acquittal. His second, that November, acquitted him outright. He maintained his innocence until his death in 1959 in a psychiatric hospital. Look at what that acquittal really says. The justice system had finally produced a defendant who had confessed, and the jury still wouldn't convict, because too many people no longer trusted the case at all. That isn't a search for the truth. It's a town that knew, on some level, the truth had been lost for years. So who did it? At this distance, no one knows, and likely no one ever will. The businessman was never charged. The higher man had an alibi. The minister was acquitted twice. There was even a fourth man named Henry Lee Moore, who months later axe-murdered his own mother and grandmother in Missouri, and whom a federal agent tied to the wider string, though most researchers now consider him a weak fit. One by one, every suspect was raised, pursued, and left unresolved. None ever closed. Which brings us back to that string of axe murders and to the lamp. In 2017, the writer Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James published a book called The Man from the Train. Working through decades of old newspapers, they argued that Villisca, Colorado Springs, Ellsworth, Parlor, and dozens of other family axe murders between 1898 and 1912 were the work of a single man. Their candidate was a German immigrant named Paul Meller, the prime suspect in an 1898 family murder in Massachusetts who slipped a year-long manhunt and vanished. Their theory was that Meller spent the next decade and a half moving by rail, choosing families in small towns near tracks, killing them with their own axe, covering the faces, draping the mirrors, leaving a lamp burning with the chimney removed, and then disappearing onto the next train. That last detail is the one from the Moore house, but there's no hard proof of any of it, and not everyone is convinced of the specific name. But the pattern is hard to wave away. The covered mirrors, the dismantled lamp, the family's own axe, the small towns, every time within reach of a railroad. Whether or not the man was Paul Meller, the shape of him repeats across too many crimes to read as a coincidence. And if some version of that is right, then the most painful part about Villisca isn't the mystery. It's that a town spent 5 years tearing itself apart over Frank Jones and a frightened preacher, ruining careers, splitting churches, fighting over which neighbour was a monster, while the man who actually did it had very likely been 1,000 miles away the whole time, riding under a different name and getting on with the rest of his life. The case officially remains open to this day. The house still stands at 508 East 2nd Street. In the 1990s, Darwin and Martha Lynn restored it to its 1912 condition, and in 1998 it joined the National Register of Historic Places. It's now a museum, daytime tours and overnight stays in the same rooms where 8 people died. But the thing that stays with you about this case isn't the axe, or the bacon, or the cigarettes in the attic. It's Lena Stillinger, 11 years old. She wasn't even supposed to be in that house. She was there because of a sleepover, because she'd asked. And in the middle of everything that happened, she seems to have been the only person in the house who woke up. For one short moment, she understood what was happening. That's the part that gets lost, when this becomes a puzzle about businessmen, detectives, and a preacher on a train. 8 people died in their beds that night. 6 were children, 2 were guests. And the truth of what happened to them was walked over by a town that loved them, then buried under 5 years of a feud that was never really about them at all. The killer was in that house for a few hours. The failure lasted the rest of the decade. That's where the case stands today. Every suspect raised, every theory left open, and every question that mattered answered too late or not at all. Of everything that doomed this case, which one do you think actually buried it? The 100 people who walked through the house that first morning? The 5-year feud between Jones and Wilkerson? Or the simple fact that nobody yet had a word for the kind of man who would do this? Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the best thing you can do to help us keep making them is to hit the like button and subscribe. If you want more in this corner of the catalogue, we've also made another video about a family of 6 that was also killed with an axe on a remote farm where the murderer seems to have lingered for days beforehand. That's the case of the Hinterkaifeck. Click the video on screen to watch it now. Hopefully, I'll see you there.